Welcome to the Pioneer Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome back onto the show for the fourth time now, Chicago ER physician and humanitarian, Dr. Thea Ahmad. Now, in this conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from what he's seeing in his own city as far as the deployment of ICE and the National Guard, obesity and the healthcare crisis, innovation in healthcare, the Gaza ceasefire, what needs to happen to see continued peace in Gaza, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of well over 1,100 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I welcome back onto the show Dr. Thea Ahmad. Enjoy. Well, Thea, I want to start by saying welcome back. This is our fourth conversation in less than 2 years. You have definitely become, not just on this show, but I think nationally or internationally, become one of the most kind of centrist voices on the whole issue as far as, what's going on in Gaza at the moment. So firstly, I just want to welcome you back. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Of course, always great to be on and able to talk about some things in detail, so I appreciate it.
So where on planet Earth are we finding you today?
Well, I'm back in Chicago after spending some time in D.C., and before that I was in the West Bank for a few weeks teaching a course and being denied entry into Gaza again.
Well, before we even go down that road, there is this kind of parallel issue that's going on at the moment where National Guardsmen and women are being deployed into national, cities in America. And there's no doubt, you and I have both seen it with our own eyes in the professions that we serve in, that we have a violence problem in this country. That being said, from an ER physician's point of view, from a resident of the city of Chicago, what are your observations about, the violence that you're seeing and then this kind of tactic that's being used at the moment?
Yeah, this is a disastrous rollout that we've seen take place here in Chicago. I think first it's important, to understand how you got to this point. And I think there's a couple of reasons, but at the end of the day, these are all moves that are motivated by political gains and not actually addressing some of the real problems that exist on the ground. And so, Chicago, I think, is one of the major metropolitan cities where we saw there was a massive influx of people who've migrated from other countries, many of whom are documented and many of whom are undocumented. And so particularly, I think we saw in the last few years, we saw a rise in undocumented migrants coming to Chicago, specifically from Venezuela, El Salvador, Latin America, but also from countries really all around the world. And they had arrived via the southern border. But I think that already existed in a public health sort of world where you were concerned about the situation that existed. Many folks were actually living out on the streets. They did not have a place that they could stay. The shelters were overcrowded and were not able to accommodate people. And I think this idea of sort of the National Guard being deployed, ICE roaming through the streets. It's just been totally disastrous because I think you saw a very organized effort from the community, really pushing back on this idea of using the United States military or increase in sort of federal officers like ICE. And we even saw actually somebody who I've met before, an alderwoman, she was in an emergency department. There were some folks that came through. They did not necessarily identify who they were, but I think the presumption is that they were likely ICE officers, and they were trying to arrest somebody who was in the hospital. And in the process, she got arrested because she was asking for them to show a badge or a warrant, and then they were able to sort of arrest her. The other thing that we're hearing take place is local leaders and aspiring, I think, elected officials. There's one person, her name is Kat Abu Ghazala. She's going to be running for Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky's district. Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky is retiring. And she actually, there's a video of her getting body slammed while she's protesting, I believe, at an ICE detention center. And she now today announced, or I think yesterday, that the FBI, the Department of Justice, is going to be charging her and 6 others with a federal crime. And so this is becoming a very politicized thing. I think we're seeing it play out. I think there's a couple of different motivations, especially when it comes to whether you're talking about fighting crime via the National Guard, which will not work. I mean, it's not going to be something that I think the city of Chicago will see a decrease in crime or a decrease in the murder rate. I mean, these are all issues that are, I think, very important to everybody that lives in the city of Chicago, but I don't think anybody thinks that we should be using the National Guard to address it. Doesn't make sense. I mean, they don't know the streets of Chicago. They don't know the communities. You're putting them in a very vulnerable position. Many of them who are here in Chicago don't look like they want to be here. So it's just, you feel like you're sort of in this game of chess between all these different politicians who are playing with American lives. The other thing is Tom Homan, who's in charge now of ICE. There's one thing I will say. He needs numbers. You need numbers. And so what you'll see, and I think what almost every American who you ask about this seems to be against it, is this guy's got to produce number of people that he's deported or number of people that he's arrested. Well, the best way to do that are the people that you have on file, or that the people that are going through the system currently, because you know where they live, where their family's at, where they work, and so you go after them first. That's why you're seeing some of these really difficult scenes where somebody's like wife just delivered and this guy's been here, and it's because they know where these folks are. And that's an easy way to get the numbers up. It's an easy way to say this quarter we deported more people than any other president ever, and then the next quarter we're going to hit these numbers as well. And so you have this weird sort of the government and its ability to sort of do things to curb the rights of individuals seems to be getting bigger and bolder, and at the same time you don't really see any sort of leadership pushing back against it in a way that unites people. I think there's been several major things that have happened in this country where we saw the lack of leadership has only sort of instigated things. And I'll give you one quick example. I thought when Charlie Kirk was assassinated that there was a moment in this country where if you had a really good leader, somebody would step up and say, okay, the way we're doing things is wrong. This is not working. Political violence is becoming more and more omnipresent in our everyday lives. It's happening all the place. Charlie was a very polarizing figure. He practices politics in a certain way, and there were a lot of people who did not like what he had to say. But this is in this moment, it's important to recognize this as something that has crossed the line in a way that we have to get back from. And I didn't see that at all from anybody. Nobody did that. Nobody stepped up and said, it's time for leadership. It's time to come together. Whether it was firebombing Governor Josh Shapiro's house in Pennsylvania, or somebody assassinating Charlie Kirk on a college campus, or the two Minnesota politicians who were murdered because of a political opponent. So I think it's a lack of leadership, and we're seeing it play out on the streets of Chicago.
One of my law enforcement friends gave me a really interesting insight. He's a former gang unit, very, very well respected, travels all over the country speaking. And he was talking about, I think none of us that are on the streets are gonna push back against the fact that there's a huge amount of violence. And if you look at it, in the Western developed world, as far as our statistics, they're awful. In fact, I just saw, I think we have 10 times the murder rate of Japan, for example, per capita.
Wow.
I mean, wow. So as we said, the way we're doing it is not working. But to your point, he said the National Guard's obviously not going to have the relationship with these local people that are, they're building so they can get to, the real kind of head of the snake, as it were. And then in our conversation, I was also saying, well, imagine if a National Guardsman shot an American. What would that do to this country? And you're putting those men and women in that scenario, and all it takes is one person who with ill intent to initiate that, and now we're going to have a national issue. So I think it's a horrendous idea. And then again with the ICE thing, no one is also saying, this is why I've you and I talked about this before, the centrist, the middle common sense voice is by far the most censored, because I've said this many times. I can't stand the extremes to the left and the extremes to the right. I was reflecting the other day, I was lauded by the left when I dared speak up about vaccine mandates with first responders and doctors and nurses after they'd been without PPE and any protection for a year, and all of a sudden they're being called murderers. I got lauded for suggesting that underlying illnesses, obesity, etc., smoking, were a massive contributor to COVID, the deaths. How dare you? Again, so apparently I'm right wing then. Then all of a sudden, now you stand up to, hey, maybe tens of thousands of children being murdered is a bad thing. And now all of a sudden, oh, you must be left wing, whatever. And so this is what's so ridiculous with the immigration. Firstly, of course, if people are over here with ill intent from other countries, you absolutely should be shipping them off and sending them back to where they came from. No one is going to dispute that. But that's not what we're seeing. We're even seeing now U.S. citizens being detained. So this is the overreach. It's not about, that everyone thinks the borders should be wide open and everyone thinks that anyone that comes in the country should be able to do whatever they want, run around raping and pillaging. No. But where is that line in the sand where you say, okay, now we're getting into government overreach? And this is happening all over the place in every level that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I would rephrase it too. I don't think that we would call I don't think centrist is the right word. I would say there's sort of a values-based approach to how we want our society to look. We have these certain values. We have a priority that is human life and human dignity. And I think, that's and I think you're totally spot on. It's like the more extreme you are with these identity politics, you stop critically thinking about how am I affecting the other human beings that are here, and you start losing all of it. You don't get a chance to have a nuanced discussion where you can learn about facts and also respect each individual for who they are. And there's two things that came to mind. There has been National Guard that have killed Americans before. This happened in our country, and it was during the Vietnam War and the anti-war protests. It happened at Kent State.
You're fine.
Sorry. Yeah. It happened at Kent State shooting in 1970. There was National Guard deployed, anti-Vietnam protests. It was clearly bad policy in this country in terms of engaging in the Vietnam War. There were an incredible amount of bloodshed, and everyday Americans wanted to protest that. And the National Guard was used to crowd control, which is not why the National Guard exists. You don't need the National Guard to do that. And you had a tragic incident that took place. I think 6 or 7 people were killed. And so that's one thing that I'll say. And then the other thing about this too is, I think I spoke to both two young men, Mahmoud Khalil and Muhsin Madawi, who both were students at Columbia earlier this year. And one was a green card holder. The other was in the process of getting his citizenship here in the United States. And this whole process, when I say it's all become so politicized and it's trying to underscore politicians, both of those gentlemen were detained. Now they're out on bail, but they're going to be in this weird moment here where there may be a precedent established for this country where if somebody says something critical about the current government or about the current government's policies, then they are at risk of being deported, arrested, or whatever it is. That's not a value that we want this country to espouse. Not if we think that we have the greatest president at this time, or we think that this is the greatest country in the world. It does not mean that I don't really like what this person is saying, and so I'm going to use the system in a way to punish them. There's a word for that. Other countries do that, but they tend to be authoritarian regimes where individuals have no rights whatsoever. And I'm really worried about that, because today it is a Republican president who's doing it to who he believes are leftists. But I promise tomorrow it will be a Democratic president who will be doing it to conservatives that they feel are whatever, saying things that they don't like. You cannot weaponize the system. Once you do that, the system is at risk of collapsing.
Yeah, and we saw that. And I think that's the point, is that you get each of these camps, when you happen to say something morally courageous in the middle, that you
Yeah.
must be from that other one. And we saw
Yeah.
massive overreach during the pandemic, telling people they can't leave their homes. When
Yeah.
again, when we look at it back now and we reflect, there were groups that were definitely vulnerable, and there were lots of groups
Yeah.
that are going to have a kind of a shitty time with the cold, and then they're going to be okay again. That's the reality. So
Yeah.
it's not a left or right thing. It's a complete abuse of power thing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and again, when you are framing it in a this side versus that side, we actually do a disservice to those vulnerable populations. We do a disservice to everybody who is going to be affected by whatever policies are being implemented, because we, at the end of the day, whether it's public health or whether it's government services or whether it's just trying to be in a safer, healthier society, if you cannot get into the details or the weeds because somebody's saying, "Oh, you must be this kind of guy," or you must think this way. I mean, we're screwing over not just everybody that lives in the society, but future generations. I mean, it's just a bad way to go about discourse and dialogue.
I just made a video a few days ago on social media, and I was just pulling out how much money a lot of these industries that their products kill millions of people, how much they spent on politicians. And I use a 25-year span just because I was like, all right, well, let's go to kind of beginning of the year, pre 9/11, so we can look at the war, we can look at obesity, we can look at all things. And each time it was billions of dollars to weapons companies, to pharmaceutical companies, to fast food companies, from those industries. And the death toll was millions and millions and millions of Americans, from cigarettes, from obesity, and then the $2 trillion that the Iraq and Afghanistan war cost the American taxpayer. So my whole thing is we've got these ICE agents running around, and I can't imagine still being a firefighter and having some twat in a balaclava running up and trying to take my patient without giving any ID. Like, you'd have a bunch of firefighters being arrested from knocking out an ICE agent. I mean, it's not bravado. It's like, you think that, that was a gang member or something. If you're not going to identify yourself, we're assuming you're a bad person, not a good person.
Right.
So,
right.
But, where is the conversation of addressing the underlying issues? And if we have all these companies, that perfect example, the FDA approves OxyContin that creates this opioid crisis that we're still losing 100,000 Americans from every single year. But then they deny MDMA-led psychotherapy, which is showing to be incredibly effective for PTSD and all the things that first responders and veterans suffer from. If there's not a bigger red flag, I don't know what is. And the reason that a lot of these people are fleeing Mexico and some of the El Salvador is the ripple effect of drug prohibition, something that was forced onto the world after the 30s when we got it from Harry Anslinger. Where's the conversation of the decriminalization of addiction that's been so successful in other countries? Where's the conversation of all the proactive things that we make Americans healthier? We stop turning our streets into gang war zones in the first place. And a lot of these people from countries don't even feel the need to leave because we haven't disrupted their environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point because it goes back to what is the base of, or the values that are forcing you, or at least compelling you to do something. Where are they coming from? And so if your motivations here are tied to pharmaceutical companies and them turning a profit, well, then you can see how we can get sort of all of these different narcotics flooded into our system. You can even see how at one point our government was encouraging us to use the pain scale, and if the patient was still reporting high amount of pain, make sure you're hitting them with morphine or Norco or OxyContin or whatever the narcotic is. But on the flip side, as you mentioned, if there's promising developments in psychedelics and MDMA and all of these NMDA, all of these different new modalities, new therapies that could address a really tough problem, then you'd wonder why regulation suddenly stiffening up. Is it because somebody can't profit as much off of this? And then again, it goes back to, it's a disservice to these vulnerable people that we're dealing with. PTSD, major depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. We don't have great answers for these mental health problems. And we don't have somebody who's sitting there and viewing it from sort of the human-based perspective. This person is struggling with this addiction instead of they're addicted to this drug, they're addicted to narcotics, they made poor choices, they're a bad person, You just totally internalize all those things to them. And you're not looking at it as this is a crisis that's affecting our entire society. We're losing such a potentially productive member of this society. They are, losing their life. It has generational impacts. If you had people thinking like that instead of, oh, wow, whatever this pharmaceutical company's name is, Pfizer, could make potentially $1 billion off of this. And then once I exit out of government, I could potentially be a consultant or a government affairs sort of position. I mean, it's just nonsense. And I mean, again, I'm just very disappointed in the lack of leadership across the board on a lot of these issues. And it's because, the humanity is lost in all of this.
I just released today an episode with Dr. Todd Otten, who is a physician. He's written an incredible book actually called Ripple of Change, where it's him and then one of his patients. And it's a kind of two perspective look at the burnout in healthcare itself, but also the kind of, the spiraling, the nosedive, if you like, of American healthcare. And so again, when you look at supply and demand, if we have a nation that is 70% obese or overweight, 40% obese, of course there's going to be a drain on the healthcare. Of course the paramedics and EMTs of the world are going to be just completely burned out. Of course there aren't enough beds in the hospitals, and doctors and nurses are seeing suicides and overdoses themselves. With that lens, talk to me about your world again. I don't know if we even really dove into healthcare the last couple of conversations. So what is the state of American healthcare? Because in my perspective, it seems like if we don't make a rapid change on the health of the nation soon, we're not going to have an American healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, and I hate to kind of sound like a almost like this broken record player, but it's not person focused, it's not patient focused, it's not human focused, it's services based. So you're coming through the emergency department, you're coming to the hospital. It's all about what services can we provide, what procedures can we do, what surgeries can we bill for, and that is a disastrous strategy that is not working. The system is broken, but we just keep pumping money into it. This idea that the time that you should be focused on your health should be when you're having chest pains after you're shoveling the snow after the first winter's snow. This is a disaster. This is how people develop the heart failure. The fact that we will watch somebody continuously get, their numbers are going upwards on, in terms of their BMI and their weight and all of these things. And all we're doing is saying, well, now you have diabetes, so these are the medicines that you should be prescribed, as opposed to saying, hey, here's some nutritional education for you. Here's some things that you should be focused on. Here's why lifestyle and exercise are so important. We're not doing these things. We're not actually looking at it holistically. I'm not thinking about the body and the human being in front of me. I'm thinking about it as here's the heart, here's the liver, here's the weight, here's the brain. Here are all of these different things. And I see it every single day in our emergency department. We are the hospital that I work out in Chicago. We are one of the busiest emergency departments in the country. We're a trauma center. But we are not able, I'm not seeing patients coming through who are these healthy people wanting to get checked up on. We're seeing people who have either never seen a doctor before or who are seeing a doctor but are not able or are not given the right information to make the right choices in their lives. And I'm watching as everything that we're doing to them, it's just the cost that's on not just them, but the entire system is skyrocketing. I mean, I think modern medicine is miraculous, but I think that the way that it's practiced is really just it falls short of where we could be and what we should be doing. I mean, you think about it. I think in this way, I think our primary care doctors, who I think are probably the most important part of this system, they're not incentivized to spend time with the person in front of them and be able to say, look, man, I know you're smoking and you're smoking a pack per day. And if you don't cut this out now, it's going to chew up your lungs and you're going to develop this horrific disease called COPD or, pulmonary fibrosis, or you're going to have coronary artery disease. And then one day you're going to clutch your chest and it's going to be a heart attack and it'll be too late at that point. They're not incentivized to talk to somebody longer than, 10 or 15 minutes. They're not incentivized. They're not being paid to sit there and talk to you about your diet, to talk to you about going to the gym, to talk to you about getting outside and getting some sunlight. They're not incentivized. What they are incentivized to do is to be able to get some blood work, look at the lab tests and be like, wow, your kidney function is worse than it was 6 months ago. let's follow it and check it again in 6 months. Let's have you go see a kidney specialist. All of these different things that are not actually to looking at somebody in totality. And what you're seeing is people are spending a lot more money. People are getting people are sicker and much less healthy. They're on more medications. They're gaining weight. They're not, there's no sort of actual education to physicians, to nurses, to healthcare providers, or to the patients. None of us are getting educated on like the holistic part of this. None of us are actually treating the mind, body, and soul. It's just one bit of the body that we're treating when we see people.
I mean, I see that too, and it's interesting because when you get into the proactive world, that's where you're at. You're at nutrition. You're at literally relationships, time in nature, exercise, sleep quality. Yeah. None of that is focusing on the renal system or the cardiovascular system. It's the whole human being. It was interesting when the conversation with Todd. Firstly, he alluded that to the fact that 20% of our GDP in this country is on healthcare. So I've said this many, many times that we don't need more money from people. They're already spending so much. And if you look at it side by side with the NHS, when you pay taxes in the UK, even though, and I'll get to this in a second, the NHS is struggling now itself. The NHS, when I was younger, it was cheaper to have it in the English system. And, when you go in, as I'm sure you understand, the first thing you're not asked is your social security number. You're just like, well, what's wrong? Okay, let's get you fixed. And then when you leave after having cancer or getting hit by a bus, you're not waiting for, a bill that's going to make you have to sell your house. You just go home and you focus on healing. But where the NHS, I think, is struggling is because they've allowed privatization to come in. And then also they've allowed the British people to get fatter and sicker. And so now you're crushing the system. So if you actually turned it around and you invested on making the nation healthier, and there's so many things that should have come out of COVID. The bolstering of local farmers to grow organic food locally. Putting PE programs back in schools, real food in schools, getting the soda machines out, pedestrianizing downtowns. You could make such a huge dent, and then there is the money for all the other things. Because if you're bleeding money on sick people, then the inverse is also true. So if you've got a healthy population, you've got lots of beds, lots of doctors, lots of nurses for everyone that needs help at that time, whether it's a pregnant woman about to give birth, whether it's an elderly person in palliative care, whether it's someone who is young when they're fighting cancer. But, at this point now, we're drowning. And even with the time, we're talking to Todd, I'm like, well, imagine this. If you said a doctor can have 30 minutes, how many 15-minute sessions will that save you down the road? Because you're actually starting to proactively, address issues. So it's a complete, false economy looking at it so short-sightedly that just come in, we'll give you a pill and then leave. I'll see you in 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually like it's pretty tragic too. I think one thing that I think about is even there now what you'll see is we kind of talk about like being extremes. You can see extremes on the other end too, because it's clearly this is such a disastrous moment. I think a lot of people that I talk to nowadays, I'll ask them, you're supposed to be taking these blood pressure pills, you're supposed to be taking these diabetes medicines. And they'll tell me something, especially from my community here. They'll say like, well, I don't want to take medicines. I don't want to keep taking medicines. And it's because they're hearing like medicines, pharmaceutical companies, that all that stuff is bad for you. And then you'll find them like taking this wonder pill that they saw on Amazon after they saw a TikTok thing. And you say, what is even in this? And they can't even tell you that. And I think it goes back to the essence of the problem. And that is that we're just not practicing this correctly. And I think you gain sort of the trust of folks, the credibility, when you are earnestly like looking at somebody and actually trying to make a difference in their lives, as opposed to saying, oh, 1 + 2 is 3. So that means you should be getting, whatever this is. You're just looking at numbers. You're not looking at the person in front of you. And I feel like people pick up on that pretty quickly. Blood pressure, your blood pressure will be raised for a good part of your life and you won't feel it. It will not have any symptoms, but we know how dangerous that this can be. And so if I'm sitting there with a patient in front of me and the first time we try to address their blood pressure, it's basically me saying, I'm going to start you on this pill that you're going to be taking for the rest of your life. how can I expect them to just buy into how I want to work on their health from in other aspects? Why not we talk about, hey, can you take an opportunity to walk 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week? And can you check your blood pressure at home and look at what you're eating? Think about what you're eating and try to cut out these things at this time. Like, that plan, somebody will say, okay, this person is not just resorting to, I want to write you amlodipine or hydrochlorothiazide or whatever the medicine is. This person is interested actually in preventative care and preventing me from having some sort of stroke or heart attack, and not, and I hate to kind of bring this in, but this is a reality, and not that if they miss something and they don't write the right medicine, then I'll hire a lawyer and I'll sue them. Right? Because I think that's all a byproduct of the same issue here. It's like you've created a system where it's like we always want to blame somebody and then you want to squeeze them for as much money as possible. So now that person is not practicing in a way that they should be practicing. They're not, they're not doing it. They're doing it. We call it scared medicine is what we'll call it. But, they're practicing this thing where it's kind of like, hey, I'm doing all the things I'm supposed to be doing. I'm throwing all this stuff at you and I'm writing it down so that you don't come back and blame me when you do have a stroke, because we never address the fact that you're eating fried processed food all the time, 3 times a day for 20 years, So I think, I think these are all, you can just see sort of the side effects of how horrible things will continue to deteriorate. We're not sort of addressing any real issue. We're just continuing to shovel it further down the road.
You had said the word trust, and I think that's a big part where, especially as let's say today, whoever the person is that stands on the podium and says, we're going to change the nation's health, we're going to start, make America healthy again. I think I heard that about a year ago, but I heard fuck all about it ever since. But anyway, I digress. That they were going to do that. Well, there'd still obviously be a large need for pharmaceuticals for a long time until we got to the kind of Scandinavian level where most of the population is very healthy. But where there isn't a conversation with these drugs is, as you alluded to, we'll put you on, hypertension meds because you're walking around at 120 over 190. That's not very healthy. You might stroke out any moment. So we need to get that down. But the goal is to get you off these pills. So let's get let's work on, your nutrition and your exercise levels, because we want to take you off. Same with the mental health ones. If you absolutely need some sort of antidepressant or whatever, version it is. All right, well then let's get you to a point where you can sit through some counseling sessions, but let's try and work to get you off these pills. But you don't see that. As you said, you're literally, and I've heard firefighters, middle-aged, healthy firefighters say, well, I'm going to be on statins forever. My doctor told me. I was like, well, and that's it? That's that you just took that as gospel? I think, that conversation too is not demonizing all the drugs, but the way that they're used. And I had a Swedish psychiatrist, and he said that they don't let their patients stay on anything longer than 6 months. Well, I mean, over here, add a 0 to that, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think, and it goes back to, when it comes to healthcare, it's a lot. There is a lot of science behind it, but there's a lot of art, and I think we're neglecting the art part about this, because you cannot paint with a wide brush for every single person who comes in with diabetes and depression. Every single person has their own unique set of circumstances, their own unique biology, their DNA, and so it's a balancing act of figuring out what's going to work for them. Hey, if you've been, if your father and his grandfather and your great grandfather and your great great grandfather all have gotten type 2 diabetes, very early on, and all of you are overweight with a BMI of 35, and you've got some bad genes there, and so you just sort of addressing it, thinking that it's going to be okay, taking insulin and making sure your sugar's under a level. It's not going to work. Something has got to drastically change, and it's my job to be able to communicate that to you and to say it in a way that you understand and to work with you on that. And I think we're just not doing a good job. I think it has to start very early. It starts in the schools. It starts in educating our children just about wellness and health and everything, whether it's mental health or physical health. I mean, we've got to do a better job. We've got to make people more informed. And I feel it in the emergency department all the time. If I know I've got 6 people waiting for me, some guy chopped his finger off, this other person fell off of a skateboard and his ankle is facing the other way. I know that I've got such limited time. I can't spend those 3 minutes telling somebody that their smoking is killing them. I can't like and they can tell also that I've got one foot out the door because I've got so many people that I've got to kind of address, right? And so it's that interaction has so much potential, and we're just kind of leaving it at zero. And I think there's ways that we can sort of address that, especially if especially if we're starting early and we're starting in the schools, and it's a part of it's not just a part of medical education or nursing school or for first responders or EMS, where hey, we're going to teach you about nutrition. It's also a part of the primary school teachers. Somebody who's teaching second grade, she's able to kind of teach her kids a little bit about nutrition. It's just like a part of the curriculum as you move forward. I promise you, in a generation or two generations, we're going to see a very different America.
Absolutely. Quick side note: did you watch The Pit?
You know what? I watched 2 episodes and I had to stop because of how legit of a show that is. I felt like I was on shift, like the same stresses. I mean, it's so good. I was so shocked by that, to be honest with you. Like that was great. Have you watched the full season?
I have, so I won't give anything away, but I know it was so successful that they're already shooting a second one, which I think is going to be out in January. But I remember one of the comments I saw when they first posted about it is, I'm a physician and I kept waiting for them to mess it up, to be so wrong on the technical direction. And they said, and I ended up watching the whole thing. So I agree completely.
No, I mean, even what I thought they did a great job of is also they showed sort of hospital administration and their role in the emergency department. They show you kind of like the interaction of like how somebody gets to the ER and what happens. And I mean, like the dynamic with pediatric patients and parents. I mean, I just thought it was incredible. And it really made me, I was like, wait, I'm supposed to be off. I'm not going to be back on shift. So it was really good.
Yeah, firstly, I was really pleased that they showed the woeful, overcrowding within the hospital, because when COVID hit, you had all those dickhead journalists out there being like, well, I'm in the hospital and there's even people waiting in the hallways. I'm like, have you never been to a inner city hospital? There's always people waiting in the hallways. This is the problem.
Absolutely.
Yep. The other thing is I'm actually turning my most recent book into a TV show, and I love the fact that The Pit was so successful. I think it was the most successful show this year, if I'm not mistaken, because what it will do, and it's not just modern day firefighters, it's like a multi-generational trauma story, but it will show, well, who are these people that bring these patients in? Because, that's another entire story that we're just not well represented. On television and film, they haven't done a good job of telling the firefighter paramedic story at all.
Oh, yeah, literally. I mean, I know there was Chicago Fire, but I don't know if you watched that at all. But yeah, that was more of a drama about relationships more than it was about the actual work, and like what happens and how that takes a toll on you as a person and on your family. So yeah, you're right, totally.
One last thing, I love bringing in innovation to some of the issues that we're struggling with at the moment. And for example, on the first responder side, the integrated nurse navigation with the 911 system, I think is genius. We have a lot of non-emergent calls. I know that we tell everyone to call 911 for everything now. So to have a 3-tier system and be able to offload the non-emergent calls to urgent care clinics and, optical and dental offices and all those kind of things, I think is amazing. I just had a guest, Josh Clementi, back on the show, and he's got an AI, company, AI and blood tests and glucose testing, continuous glucose testing. And the whole point is to really have a proactive health model. And he made an interesting comment. He said, doctors are not supposed to be treating chronic disease. They're supposed to be there for, the childbirths and the traumas and all these things. And there's so much now with this technology that can help people, somewhat monitor their own health, as far as their blood work. And so I thought that was a really interesting, AI innovation on the horizon. Not that it's replacing doctors by any means, but not waiting a full year and going, oh my God, my blood work is terrible, or my glucose is through the roof, or whatever it is, but actually the patient being empowered to actually start being in control of their own health.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key. I mean, I think you get better outcomes. I mean, I think from a like a healthcare perspective, it's always about making sure that an individual has that you're able to protect their ability to be independent, their ability to be informed, and the word you used was empowered. And I think that's perfect. Even if it's like somebody who has some sort of traumatic injury or something that takes place where they may not, they have reduced functionality. You want to improve the function so that they can be independent. And so I think these models, as long as they can bring it back to someone who feels that that the awareness is there and that they're informed and that they're able to make decisions with all of the information, as opposed to just being dependent on another human being, like on their doctor, to tell them what to do. I mean, how many times have you heard somebody say, well, or what do you think is best? I think that's a tough question. I think for physicians, we'll hear that all the time. It's like, well, what do you recommend, doctor? Should I do the surgery or should I do the treatment? I think the more that we're able to give people the tools that they need to feel like they are totally aware of what's happening, in their bodies, what's happening, their metrics with how they're moving along in life with their health, I think it's going to be awesome. I hope it radicalizes the field. I mean, we're using it on the other side. We use AI to help document our conversations now. Like we have, we're able to have a conversation with the patient. It's able to catch up on things that you would forget as you're heading back to your computer to write down. Like, wait, when did they say was the last time they ate something? Or, did they say they took their medicine today? Like it's able to hear all of that. It's able to synthesize it. It's able to also kind of spit back out at you, like, here's some of the things that you should think about. Which is, I think overall, if this is something that can help folks feel like they have a better grasp of what's happening to them, and they don't feel lost, and they don't feel like they're being dictated to, and they don't feel like they have to be dependent on someone else, I think it's going to be hopefully a good thing.
If I was still in, I would hope that it would also help you fill in all the pertinent negatives, because I used to hate that. They scaremongered in paramedic school, like if you don't write a thesis, then some lawyer's gonna, and I'm like, no, if I didn't write it down, all else was within normal limits, that means everything else. But to be able to have that, it's a rolled ankle, like you said, you're not obviously taking breath sounds and these other things. No, everything else was fine. We looked at the injury.
But do you know, and do you know what that's caused? I mean, that means nobody reads anybody's notes. I'm not looking at the EMS sheet. The doctor who I admit to is not looking at my note. The nurse is not looking at the nurse that she's getting it handed off from, because there's so much superfluous information that's just regimented that you've got to write down. I can't, I'm not going to scroll through 3 pages of things where I'm trying to figure out, somebody in front of me who's yelling in pain. So, I think it's produced a negative effect, this idea of like having to go through, and hopefully AI can fix the over documentation that we see. I mean, there's a problem with over documentation. There's a problem with under documentation. And so you hope it can bridge that gap. I hope that that's something that, will produce better care and better healthcare providers.
Absolutely. Well, the last time that we spoke was April, and now we'll kind of shift to Gaza. At that point, I think you were just starting to see the kind of ripple effect of starvation, because I think, if I remember serves me right, you were talking about, this was a slow process, that as you're shutting it down, it's not like people are just suddenly dropping like flies. There's weeks and weeks before you see deaths from that. Right. So kind of walk us through as far as, that continuing, because obviously that didn't suddenly stop after our conversation. What is the impact as we speak now? And then obviously we can get to the ceasefire and some other things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that I think are important to recognize here. First is that what was really frustrating is you saw world leaders, you saw different governments start to, I think, recognize the concern surrounding the forced starvation that was being inflicted on the Palestinians in Gaza. This was a very intentional policy that was being implemented from October 2023. And exactly like you said, you don't get to famine. You don't get to severe acute malnutrition. You don't get to the point where children are starving to death. That doesn't happen in a couple of weeks. It doesn't happen in a month. It was a very strategic military policy being implemented by Israel, so much so that they were counting the tons of food they were letting in. They were counting the calories per Palestinian in Gaza. And so, this is, if you look at the World Food Program, you look at any UN agency, you look at Save the Children or Oxfam or any humanitarian organization that was on the ground in Gaza, they were warning about this from late 2023, early 2024. And so what were we seeing on the ground? We were seeing 70% of pregnant women were delivering premature babies with complications. We are talking about every 3 out of 4 pregnancies where the kid is coming early. That's already a nightmare, but it's occurring in the environment of American fighter jets with Israeli pilots dropping American bombs, with no fuel, with the access to care being cut off or limited because the presence of the Israeli military is beginning an offensive in this city in Gaza. And so we were putting vulnerable people like pregnant women, breastfeeding women, children between the ages of 6 months and 5 years old, people with diabetes or high blood pressure, elderly folks, people who have been injured earlier in this aggression. We were seeing them start to show these kind of signs of starvation. And you're looking at kids whose growth are stunted, whose immune systems are weakened. And so they're they're getting infected with the cold or some stomach bug, and it's taking forever for them to recover from that. You're seeing developmental delays. You're seeing, children who are being held out of school for this entire time period. But I go back to what my frustration was, is this didn't happen in a vacuum, but suddenly you've got world leaders speaking out and saying, the hunger in Gaza is unacceptable and we have to get food, we have to get food, we have to get food. And it goes back to the earlier part of our conversation. You're not addressing the root cause of this problem. There is a suffocating siege on the Gaza Strip, and there is a military that's operating in a way that's trying to make sure life is not sustainable. Who cares if I bring in food for 3 consecutive days and somebody's able to get 3 square meals if I'm just going to cut off that food a week later? This is not rocket science. The child who was dealing with all of the issues of malnutrition, if I just feed them for a few days, I have not addressed the problem if they're going to go back to being hungry the following week. They are still going to be at risk of death and complication. And we still saw the hospitals in Gaza be targeted. We saw that doctors continue to be abducted, the nurses and the first responders be killed or abducted or wounded. And so you got to look at it 360 degrees. The international body that declares famine in all of these different areas across the globe, they declared a famine in Gaza. They said there are they said this in July, where they released this report. And the response from the Israelis was, this report is garbage, it's political or whatever it is. And the rest of the world was like, there's got to be food that enters, this sort of report is supposed to compel the international community to say, everyone come together, tell the Israelis to open the borders and allow aid to enter. The Israelis are saying, well, if we allow aid to enter, some of the aid gets stolen. Who cares? Keep the aid running in. It does not matter at that point. Who cares if some of this aid is getting stolen? Who cares if it's being looted? The reason that it's being looted and stolen in the first place is because you have made it such a rare and valuable commodity that the way to counter that is to just let a bunch of bananas and apples and bread in. And so we were putting these people in Gaza in this position where they were essentially starving, and that the local markets had increased the prices by 5, 6, 7-fold. Nobody's working anymore because the whole place is being leveled to the ground. And the other thing that I don't think people have had a chance to think about is the lack of exposure to different food groups of the population. I mean, we're talking about kids for 2 years did not have any animal protein whatsoever. You are talking about them getting some bread, and every once in a while they're getting a can of beans or some other canned foods. This is beyond them being starved, which is an assault against the human body. They're also, sitting there not being exposed to all of these different nutritious food groups and different items, and it's just this cruelty that continued to surge. And people were just talking about We get more food has to come in. We want to see more food come in. Well, you're not going to really address this issue. You're not going to address this problem. And I think the last thing I'll say about that is, the things were getting so intense in Gaza. We were seeing more than 100 people every single day be killed in some sort of bombing or some attack or some tank shelling. And we were seeing all of these kids that were being born in so prematurely. They were stuck in the hospitals that were still partially functioning. And we're seeing families continue to get displaced. So they're moving from in this ever shrinking area where the Gaza Strip keeps getting smaller because the Israeli military footprint keeps getting larger and expanding its operations. And so smaller areas, overcrowded, families on top of each other in these areas very close to the Mediterranean Sea. And there was no end in sight. I mean, there was nothing that was changing with respect to access. I had been rejected in March 13th, June 19th, and most recently October 9th. And I am not unique by any means. 50% of international humanitarians who were trying to enter into Gaza over this time period, the last 6 months where everything was collapsing, were being rejected by the Israelis. We're talking about Americans, Brits, Europeans. We're getting rejected for no reason. At the same time, you're watching physicians like myself. I'm flying to Jordan trying to get in. And in my bags, I'm trying to smuggle baby formula in, specialized baby formula. And when I'm getting rejected, that baby formula is not entering, of course. And it's not like it's any sort of impactful contribution, right? It's only just, I'm coming in, I can get you a couple of bottles of baby formula here, and maybe we'll be good for a week for the 6 kids that are in this in neonatal intensive care unit. And we're not able to get folks out of Gaza either, for example, who needed somebody who has, I know there's a girl right now in Gaza, her name is Maryam. She's struggling with a severe gluten allergy. And so the flour that you're bringing in that keeps coming in through the aid, it doesn't do anything for her. It has the gluten in it, and she's sitting there losing weight. We're watching her become skin and bones, just agonizing, days and weeks of her life. And so nothing changed, right? Like, the Israelis are still very much in control of allowing things to enter, and it's not enough. People are not able to exit because there's a suffocating siege. And then the international community has been crippled in a way that's not able to mount an effective emergency response. I can't get food in. I can't get doctors in. I can't get nurses in. I can't get humanitarians in. And I sure as hell can't get any sort of fuel, clean water, or proper tents in either. So total catastrophic disaster where all aspects of life were being attacked.
I was so proud to see the Irish step up so early. And we talked about this. I mean, my analogy of what happened in Gaza is, when I was young, the IRA were bombing the mainland and it was an occupation. Like, the British were in Northern Ireland. And, I don't care how long it's been. To me, the answer is to let Ireland be its own country. That's my personal opinion. I don't understand why we need to occupy that, but at the same time have a great relationship, because we're 2 tiny rocks in the middle of the ocean, have some sort of overarching name for all 4 of us together working collaboratively, but everyone having their own. But back then, like, I grew up next to I probably told you this in one of the other ones, next to an MOD base, military base. So I literally, when I was young, we were sweeping the car for bombs before I went to school. So felt that. But it would be like one of the mainland bombings, which happened all the time, shopping centers, women, children, that then we go in, the British, and basically destroy the entire city of Belfast. The world would not have tolerated that, not at all.
Yeah.
And so, the Irish people collectively have been one of the earliest voices, and then the South Africans as well. But, I've been so disgusted, obviously, with the States, and we'll get into that in a minute. But even the UK, like, until very, very recently, they were really no different than the US.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've had a lot of engagement on this issue with many different countries, especially the Europeans. I mean, the European Union is by far the largest trade partner for the state of Israel. And so that there's an opportunity there to apply some pressure and to improve conditions by leveraging that very special relationship. The UK has its paws all over the situation in Palestine. And one thing I'll say too is, I think David Lammy announced at the UN that he was going to recognize the state of Palestine. He got this massive applause. And then there was sort of a delay, and he said, if the Israelis don't do XYZ. And so, for me, it was like this hedging of bets where you really know that there are countries that need to step up and use their relationship in a way that kind of alleviates this absolute catastrophe that's taking place. And the British, one thing I'll say about them too, and I don't think people realize just how entangled all these countries are. Again, the European Union, so all of these European states, they are the largest trade partner with Israel by far. The Israeli economy depends on the Europeans, for sure. The British, their spy planes were instrumental for the Israeli campaign against Palestinians in Gaza over the last 2 years. This genocide is not possible without British intelligence, without British surveillance. It doesn't happen. And also without, of course, British political cover. And then same with comes to the Germans. They are the second largest arms supplier of the Israelis, where America is, of course, number one. The Australians are providing parts for their fighter jets. Even the Irish were, helping with the transfer of weapons. But I do want to say, I think the Irish and then Spain, in terms of the Europeans, took the most, I think, morally consistent approach in this entire thing, the entire time. The Irish, I think, have been very vocal. They've not been afraid to use rhetoric that at least centers the suffering of Palestinians. Oftentimes you won't see that. People will try to eliminate the suffering of people because it evokes, very visceral responses. But the Irish were keen on sort of bringing that up. They were standing in solidarity, of course. And then they did things like have children come to Ireland to get medical treatment, to be evacuated there. They would always, I think, bring this up when it comes to the, with respect to the UN, try to focus on the plight of children. In fact, I spoke at one of their events at their mission to the UN in New York City, and it was about children, and they invited me to speak there. So they, I think that sort of moral consistency has been absent from a large part of the Western world. You see Spain has, I think, also tried to take a more hardline tone, but you really need major countries like the US, UK, and Germany. To me, those three have still been absent from really approaching it from a morally consistent position. I am watching the UK shift their position a lot. They're saying things and they're moving in the right direction. But the US, I think one of the major concerns, and I think this is something why you will see vigorous defense of the Israelis. When it's all said and done, this will be referred to as a genocide. You are talking about the International Court of Justice saying that there is a plausible genocide. And then you watched the International Criminal Court, the ICC, issue arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, for Yoav Gallant, his defense minister at the time. You watched UN special rapporteurs who are independent and are not being paid for this compile hundreds of pages of reports saying that what the Israelis did in Gaza is a genocide. You watched the UN Commission of Inquiry, which spent over a year getting testimonies, collect evidence, call it a genocide. You watched humanitarian organizations, which generally do not want to get involved in these legal terms, like Doctors Without Borders, MSF, call it a genocide. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International called it a genocide. Israeli organizations, B'Tselem, and Physicians for Human Rights Israel called it a genocide. So why is the U.S. so vehemently opposed to any critique of Israel? They refer to it in D.C. as they don't want to have any daylight between Israel and the United States, especially when it comes to their support. Why? What's the case here? One, it's the implication that if the Israelis are committing genocide, who helped them commit the genocide? And if you find that all of these weapons that we're sending are American weapons and the fighter jets are American fighter jets, it's really that sort of accountability will also eventually come towards you. So I think there's some resistance there. But then the second part of this, which is changing in this country because of people, not because of politicians or parties, but because of people, is there was only one approach to foreign policy in the Middle East when it came to Israel. And that was unconditional support. Unconditional support. Always support. Anything they need, say yes, yes, yes. I think you're seeing a movement in this country on both the left and the right, especially the more populist, the more populism seeps into our politics, where people are like, but why? Why are, if you're an America First person, why are we sending, in the last, 2.5 years, we've sent over $30 billion there, towards weapons. Why are we taking part in the starving of children if you're somebody who comes from a faith-based background? If you're on the left and you believe in progressive values, you can't be progressive except for Palestine. It doesn't make sense. And so I think you're noticing people are starting to ask those questions and get critical of it. And I'll tell you, as somebody who spent the last 2 years of their life traveling from capital to capital, talking to different international governments that have tried to bring attention on this, I see that happening globally. But I think if there is no accountability at the end of the day, as we're in this very weird, precarious moment, if we're still not talking about, hey, some things happened here where we've got to have some sort of accountability, it bodes very poorly for everybody else, for the entire world. If we have allowed hospitals and first responders to just be gunned down as they're responding to a call, like we saw what happened with the Palestinian Red Crescent first responders, when they're responding to a call and they've got their ambulance and their fire truck sirens and lights on, and they get gunned down, 15 of them, and nobody is held accountable for that. Not even the commander who said fire away. Or you see a 6-year-old like Hind Rajab who's sitting in a car with her entire family dead around her, and an Israeli tank 25 meters away that blasted 342 bullets into the car, and we hear her die over 6 hours. She's bleeding to death, and we send 2 ambulance drivers, Ahmad and Yusuf, to go and save her life, and they're 100 meters away on a pre-approved Google map a route that they were given by the Israelis, and then a missile hits them and blows up their ambulance. Nobody's held accountable for either of those people perishing. So if that doesn't happen, and I don't have a lot of faith that it will, based on the stances that these governments have taken over the last 2 years, then the next major conflict, whether it's in Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, wherever it is, will look similar, if not worse. And that's not a world that we want our children to grow up in. That's where you're leading to, the end of times, apocalypse-like pictures like we saw in Gaza.
Well, what blows me away is it was 2 generations ago that Americans and British, fought, so selflessly, so courageously for all the right reasons. Because I've always said, there are wars that are absolutely, unavoidable, and they're very, very few and far between. And then you have all the other ones that, as we talked earlier about Vietnam, that we should never have gone to in the first place. And if you look even behind the scenes of that, it was more about trade, ports, and some of those things than it was ever about humanitarian. But I just can't imagine what that generation would think about this. And the fact that you have the audacity, not you, people have the audacity to call opposition of what is going on anti-Semitism, when it's not saying, well, this is all Jewish people. It's not saying this is all Israeli people. It's saying those that are committing the atrocities. I don't think that every German was behind, all the things that happen in their country, or every Austrian, or every Italian, every Russian. Yeah. I don't think every Russian wants to be in the Ukraine right now. So this is the point, is that right is right and wrong is wrong. And if you, as we have heard from the rhetoric in this country, the moment that someone stands up and says, hey, this is wrong, regardless of the backstory, that you can say, well, they've been fighting for whatever. Yeah, but then if you go far enough back, look at how the British impacted that, and all these, other countries that have created this in the first place. But regardless of that, if the IRA bombed mainland Britain and we came in and bombed every single part of the city of Belfast, schools, hospitals, we gunned down first responders, how would the world respond? Very, very differently than we're seeing now. So it's up to us, the people, to stand up and say, enough is enough. And if there's a tyrant at the helm of our ship, then what, are we a passenger? No, we are the reason that the ship exists in the first place.
That's right. Yeah. And I think it gets back to, when you talk about accountability, that's how you are able to avoid any sort of accusations or allegations that would derail the conversation. At the end of the day, what I am looking at in terms of the last 2 years, because that is what I'm hyper focused on right now, is I'm looking at what's happened to Palestinians in Gaza over the last 2 years. I am looking at the military leadership of the Israeli military, and I'm looking at the political leadership of the government that's in power currently. I could care less about any other details right now. That is who I am focused on. They are the ones who said, drop all the bombs. They are the ones who said, move in and move this way. And so, I think anybody that tries to change the conversation into well, you're trying to essentially label all of these people this way, or you're behaving in this manner. I think they're not serious about the conversation at play here. They're going to allow people like Benjamin Netanyahu to get away with sort of all of his failures, including his security failure on October 7th, his inability to sort of defend his own people on that day. So I think that's something that he needs to be held accountable for. And so, that's why it's always about accountability. It's about justice. And at the end of the day, if you're not serving that, then you're going to not have addressed the issue in any impactful way. I truly, truly believe that. I mean, we're talking here in the United States now about military action in Latin America. I mean, you are watching people, again, the same people who love to send other people's kids to the front lines of battles, the folks who probably have never served a single day in their life. You hear them now saying, Nicolas Maduro should leave. One way or the other, he's going to leave. We're talking about Latin America. When you start hearing rhetoric like that, they want boots on the ground. They want to engage in military activity, and they want to make sure other people's sons and daughters are the ones fighting these wars that will inevitably cause the bodies to pile up, people to suffer, and tragedy to occur. And that's what bothers me. It just really kills me because, I saw it take place over the last 2 years. I see these Israeli ministers who are extreme by all standards, very extreme, very hateful, very racist individuals. And I see their tweets. I follow them on X, and I see their posts. And it is absolutely inhumane, the stuff that they tweet out there, the joy that they get about a school getting bombed and 15 kids getting killed, and them saying, oh well, yeah, this is what they have to pay a price because of what happened beforehand, or this is how we get our revenge. And you're like, these people should not be in power. They should not be anywhere near other human beings, let alone in a cabinet position for a government. So I worry about that, and I see signs of that here in our own country, where you have people who are just so willing to say, hey, to scream war and to be so happy to engage in war and to fight like you said. I mean, I think, Howard Zinn is this historian, he's the late Howard Zinn, but, he had made the argument that, there's always these, in American history, at least, they talk about the three sort of good wars. Like, these are wars that were fought for moral reasons. And he talks about the American Revolutionary War, he talks about the Civil War, and he talks about World War II. And he then he goes into detail about how there were really horrible things that were done during these wars, and how you cannot just sugarcoat everything. If you're going to do something, just understand the human consequences as a result of this. And I don't think people are doing that. I don't think that you're seeing people in power, especially, who are considering the human cost and who are considering that sort of element of it. No, they're considering the defense contracts, the weapons, industry, and they're considering, their political positions and appearing powerful. I hate that.
I've had so many veterans on now, veterans of Afghanistan war and in Iraq specifically, and you listen to these real warriors. There's no question that there were times when they were out there that they made, a difference in that particular place, if they were being oppressed by a Taliban or whoever it was, or whether they were just, helping build a school, or, the physicians helping, local people that were sick. So I think a lot of them can be proud of their service, but when they ask, well, why were we there in the first place, and why were we there for so long, and then why did we leave the way we did, and why did we allow these people to go back in power and kill so many of these courageous, indigenous people that fought alongside us, that now they're beheaded and all their family killed, that there's a real cautionary tale there. And I was talking to someone about this show that I'm making with my new book, that even though it doesn't take place in that era, it's that same thing. Like, we should be still hearing from our veterans. It should be front and center, because they're the ones that that's the new war is hell conversation is coming from our Middle East veterans from all the countries, the veterans from Iraq and everyone. And so,
Right.
like you said, these politicians, they send other people's kids to war. And it absolutely disgusts me. Another thing that you don't see put front and center, because let's be completely honest, there is a section of Islamophobia that's going on at the moment that are all, up in arms and, celebrating the fact that this is going on in Gaza because, they're obviously not a fan of the Muslim faith. So where's the conversation about the Christian churches that have been killed and the Christians within Gaza? So talk to me about that for the people that, let's say someone's listening that only cares about people that in their own faith.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to understand Palestinian culture and society. There is no religious tension that exists between Palestinian Christians and Muslims. And I think that probably that has to do with both sort of suffering under occupation, and if you live in Gaza, kind of unites you. And but there aren't the same tensions that exist that you may see in other areas where there are sort of different people of different backgrounds and faiths. In fact, I'll give you an example. Of course, my mother went to a Catholic school. She's Muslim, went to a Catholic school growing up in Jerusalem, and it's in Ramallah, which is where in the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority is based. Ramallah is a traditionally a very Christian and Muslim town, and so you're talking about a society that's part and parcel of being Palestinian, is either being Muslim or Christian. I've even heard there's some Jews too. So that's I think the idea here is that this is a very sacred land to many different faiths. And, I visited Jerusalem very recently, and I went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because I'm just fascinated by the old city. And one of the main people that is monitoring it, he's a volunteer, doesn't get paid, but he's sort of like making sure that, people aren't filming TikToks inside of, very, sacred areas. He's this, Palestinian man. And he's somebody who lives in Jerusalem, Palestinian Christian, who can recount for his entire adult life the abuses and the sort of discrimination that he encounters being in a city that's surrounded by Israeli police and military. And in Gaza specifically, there is this ancient one of the oldest churches in the world is in Gaza. It's always been there, of course, and regardless of who was in control of the Gaza Strip, it's always kind of had the freedom to sort of exist and move. And I want to mention this very specifically. This is the Al-Ahli Baptist Church. Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, would FaceTime the clergy in this church every single day until he died. He was FaceTiming them during the assault. This is a church that had been bombed, but many of its congregants were actually sheltering and displaced in the church. So they were living around the church and inside of the church. We're talking about almost 2 years here. And Pope Francis would continuously talk to them, and you could see on different videos. Actually, there's one video that was caught where he's asking them, well, what did you guys eat today? And because they were just like all these other Palestinians in Gaza being starved, the Palestinian Christians were being starved too. And so they were, you're talking about a very small minority in Gaza with this very rich history that's at risk of being erased. This church that's been there forever, one of the oldest churches in the world, at risk of being reduced to rubble, just like the rest of Gaza. And so the Israelis had approved a decision that the entire world told them, don't do this. They said, we're going to do a Gaza City offensive. Gaza City is the most populated city in all of Gaza, and is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. It is more densely populated in normal times than Tokyo, Japan. It's more densely populated.
Wow.
And the church is in Gaza City. That church, this ancient historic church, is in Gaza City. The Israeli military issued displacement orders for all of Gaza City. And you saw 300, 400, 500,000 Palestinians start walking south away from the military. This church, all of the congregants, the clergy, everybody came together and they made the decision, we're not leaving. and they refused to leave despite the bombing all around them, despite the tanks moving in and the ground troops invading. They made the decision not to leave. And I give them so much respect and credit for that, to make that horrifying decision. But it is unbelievably courageous, but also they were not going to be erased. And I think, I think when we think about, when Palestinians like myself, we think about, we want to preserve our tradition and our culture and our history. That is a very, very important piece to the puzzle. Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem, and one of our national leaders is a pastor from a church named Mundir Isaac. I think you should, if I can somehow connect you to him, I would love to connect you to him, because he's such an important voice. He is one of the leading voices for Palestinians in the diaspora and on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza. He's a thought leader, and he's somebody who sort of is a moral compass for so many of us. These are the sort of, when we talk about Palestinian Christians, they're Palestinian, just like a Palestinian Muslim person, and they have gone through every single struggle that Palestinians have gone through. They've not been given any sort of exception. And oftentimes we see them as they walk through the old city of Jerusalem, they get harassed more and they get attacked more. I mean, stories of being spit on, of being hit, of being, just blockaded. They endure the same struggles. And I'll give one last example. When there are major Christian holidays, whether it's Mass for Christmas Eve or Easter, the ability to access the old city, they endure the same sort of restrictions and blockades and occupation that the rest of the Palestinian population does. These are you're talking about the most significant holidays for an entire faith. And you're talking not just that this is happening in Chicago or in London or in Berlin. You're talking about the hub, kind of the center of where this faith started. And you are watching sort of discrimination against them. I hope people can understand that, because I feel like in this country specifically, a certain evangelical flavor will try to paint this as like, hey, this is a struggle between, the Jewish faith and the Muslim faith. No, it's not. That's not the case at all. It is a struggle between a military that is occupying and an indigenous people who are just trying to preserve who they are, because we've seen many people in their sort of positions in the past get erased. And I think it's important just for people to put that context into place.
And just so I'm clear, there have been Palestinian Christians killed, and there have been Palestinian churches, Christian churches, destroyed.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's again, I actually don't think I don't think, I know that the health ministry in Gaza does not distinguish based on faith, but you will people in Gaza, there was nowhere that was safe. And so wherever Palestinian Christians or Muslims or, any other faith, all of them have been subjected to the same intense violence that we've seen on display. Palestinian American Christian journalist in Jenin before October 7th, 2023. In 2023, the most, up until October 7th, was the deadliest year in the West Bank since the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. And in Jenin, the Israeli military was conducting operations, and it was becoming very intense. One of the most famous journalists, her name is Shireen Abu Akleh. She is a Palestinian American, New Jersey native, worked for Al Jazeera. I remember growing up with Shireen, reporting from the ground. She was hit by an Israeli sniper and killed. No accountability, nobody brought to justice. State Department was not able to produce any sort of investigation about Shireen. She's a Palestinian Christian. On the day of her funeral, because the Israeli police and military in Jerusalem, because she was going to be buried in Jerusalem, because her family was from there, they were beating the people who were carrying her coffin. And what they found, a group of Muslims gathered around, picked up the coffin, and you can watch the video of them get beaten, but insisted on carrying the body of Shireen until she could have been given a proper burial. So this is, she's somebody who was loved by all of us. I grew up, I'm Muslim. Shireen is a part of my childhood, of watching her report from the ground, and to watch her just get gunned down the way she was gunned down, just a sniper hitting her in the head. It's her second anniversary passed recently. It's one of those things. Again, I talk about no justice, no accountability.
Yeah, I mean that is just one of so many heartbreaking images, and as you alluded to, I mean Hind's story and the first responders, the firefighters and the paramedics that were gunned down. I mean, it's unending, and this is what I don't understand: is that why people can't separate political ideologies and just look as a human being. The same thing as we've talked about many times. The people that were killed on October 7th, that's a tragedy as well. And why can you not just say that those two things can exist simultaneously?
That's what really bothers me. I don't think anybody is serious about protecting human rights and making sure that civilians aren't targeted, and making sure that at least if you're going to have something take place, that the sanctity of hospitals, churches, mosques, all these things are sort of protected. You're not serious if you somehow find exceptions for those rules depending on who the people are. Depending on what their skin color is, or what their faith is, or what their background is, or what their politics are. So, it's something that I think, again, we're heading down the wrong path for sure. Those interesting thing too that I didn't realize until very recently, and I had posted about this, was with Hind and Ahmad and Yusuf, the two first responders. I didn't realize that they were at. It's just crazy how this story, no matter how you look at it, is just absolutely tragic. But they got the dispatch while they were at the Ahli Baptist Hospital that had been bombed in early October 2023. So they were there, stationed there at this hospital that had been bombed. And they were talking to one of the young journalists, Ismail Al-Ghul, who was a journalist that was killed, of the more than 225 journalists killed in Gaza. So it's like, every single part of that story had death and tragedy connected to it. We just didn't know at the time. So it was, really just tough story to deal with. I visited the call center, the Palestinian Red Crescent in the West Bank, that took the call of Hind on the phone. They spent obviously more than 3 hours with her. I saw the desk where they took the call. I saw the call center. They showed me kind of how they respond. And they had this poster of all of the first responders who had been killed in 2 years. And, it was really tough. I mean, these pictures of these guys wearing their uniform, smiling, posted up there, knowing that they were killed in the line of duty. Those people, I don't know. I mean, again, I hate to say it again, but those people deserve justice. I mean, their families deserve justice. These guys, man, they absolute heroes for even deciding to get in a car, or to go and try to dig somebody out of, from some rubble, or try to put out a fire while there was a kid running through trying to, rescue them. And to think that they were, the fact that they were wearing their vests is put a target on their back. It kills me. And I really don't want to let that slide, even if there is, which I think we're going to talk about now, some sort of fragile ceasefire that's maintained, or whatever it is. Those guys deserve justice.
I posted one of the rescues from some of the rescue workers, and it was a successful rescue, and it was a very young girl. And again, just seeing some of the comments, it blew me out. I don't want to go down that whole internet troll thing, but people that I know, like that were first responders themselves, who I spent time with in person a few months ago, basically saying, I'm not going to be part of the podcast anymore. Why would you share Al Jazeera? I'm like, it's a video of a young girl being rescued after a bombing by men that share the same exact uniform as me. And if you still are so ingrained in your messiah of the left or the right, whoever it is, that you can't even see humanity anymore, I got nothing for you. I mean, I'm sorry, but if there's not a red flag for the mental health crisis in this country is the lack of moral compass, then you're not going to be able to persuade that person back into the middle. That person needs to look in the mirror and go, where is my compassion? I need to go do some work on myself.
Yeah. I mean, it's a crisis of empathy, and it goes back to dehumanization. If you can quickly dehumanize the other person that you're looking across, if you can quickly somehow make them less human than you can do anything. I mean, anything is possible at that point. And these guys, they are digging with their hands. They're being exposed. I mean, we know this from 9/11. Like these first responders and police officers and firefighters that rushed into a building that was on fire but also collapsing. If they survived, then they still dealt and they are still dealing with lifelong health problems. Well, it's the same thing with these folks here. They're with their bare hands trying to dig through the rubble. There's all these fumes coming up from the bomb that was just dropped. So, I mean, again, they don't get enough credit. They don't get enough honor and respect. And for those that have been killed, I think, comments like that, or people who are sort of like they actually fuel me to make sure that I want to tell their story. I want to confront everyone with their faces, with pictures of them at the most recent birthday party. I don't want you to deny their humanity, and if I have to, I will continue to shove that not just in everybody's face who kind of sat idly by, who could have made a difference and changed something, but to people who may also lack that sort of empathy. I want to confront them with this, and maybe that's the way that they can it can awaken something inside of them, where they can be like, damn, that guy, he's wearing a Spider-Man shirt, just like, I have a Spider-Man shirt or something like that. You know what I mean?
Exactly. So let's get to the ceasefire. James Gearing's perspective was one of the basically allies of these tyrants, then started parading around saying, I deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm going to stop this crisis. Now, to me, that would be like Mussolini saying that he was instrumental in stopping the genocide in World War II. That's just my personal opinion. So I'll leave that there. Talk to me about the so-called ceasefire, the fragility, and then, what's threatening it as we sit here now on October 29th, 2025.
Yeah. So this is actually a very sad and convoluted way that we got to the ceasefire. Donald Trump was elected as president, and in late January, right before he's supposed to have his inauguration, he essentially demonstrated what President Biden could not do. He told the Israelis through Witkoff, his special envoy, who's a billionaire real estate person based in New York, who the president trusts a lot, trusts more than Secretary Marco Rubio, who you I think have probably noticed is absent from these Middle East negotiations, as well as the Ukraine-Russia stuff. So Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is the guy. So Witkoff basically tells the Israelis and really forces it on them that you need to get a ceasefire done. Nothing's going to distract from the president's inauguration. And sure enough, a ceasefire deal is secured, and it's this phased approach: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1, you're going to release there's going to be an exchange of prisoners between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and then you saw that sort of take place. And then they're going to allow Palestinians who are displaced to the south to go to the north. So we saw all of that take place. The ceasefire phase 1 expiration was 50 days, 50. During that time period, the Israelis, who were previously blockading UN trucks from getting in, were allowing trucks to enter. And these UN agencies, these humanitarian organizations, they were doing an amazing job. About 600 trucks a day. They were getting it out there. The difference on the ground was felt by everybody on the ground in that short time period. And everybody's sort of like, damn, like this could work. March 2nd, ceasefire deal expires. And we are hearing that there have been no progress towards the phase 2 of the negotiations. March 18th, the Israelis violate the ceasefire agreement and unleash hell on Gaza. I have many colleagues who were in Gaza at the time, 5 of my pretty good friends, and they talk about night and day. Just drones are overhead, fighter jets are overhead, bombing incessantly every 10, 15 minutes, and just pure pandemonium. And I remember being in DC January and February, visiting different offices and specifically saying, we cannot allow this ceasefire deal to fall apart. It will be the cruelest thing imaginable. It will be so incredibly cruel to give a glimmer of hope that there's going to be some stability and some entry of aid, and then just to rip that all away from them. And sure enough, on March 18th, we saw things escalate, and we talked a little bit earlier about how they escalated to the point where there was famine on the ground, there was more displacement, and then we talked about the Gaza City offensive, where Palestinian Christians in the heart of Gaza City refused to abandon their church and refused to leave despite the Israelis bearing down on them. So what happens? Well, the Palestinian factions, including Hamas and other groups, are signaling to the Trump administration that they're ready to accept this sort of Trump peace proposal that's been on the ground since January, and they are coming together in Doha, Qatar, to give their formal agreement to Trump's peace proposal. And all of this is being leaked by different journalists saying, they're very optimistic they're going to have a deal. The president himself says, I think we're going to have a deal in 2 days, maybe 1 week. And so momentum is building. This tells you just how insane Benjamin Netanyahu and his thugs are. They make the decision to scramble their fighter jets and to cross the Red Sea and head to Qatar and bomb where the Palestinians are meeting to give their response to President Trump. So this has been one of a series of really irrational and insane acts by the Israelis, but there's a twist this time. This time, the people they're trying to kill, for whatever reason, had stepped out of the room. And so this very insane decision where if he had killed those people, Netanyahu could have came out and said, these guys were dicking around. They were not serious about this peace proposal. And we sent them a message because they were going to continue to, we killed them. They were responsible for whatever it was. Instead of that, now he had an international crisis on his hands because the Trump administration is fuming that they did this. The Qataris, of course, are like, we're not going to help. We're not going to be the middleman anymore for any of you people. Despite Obama asking us back in the 2000s to open an office for the Taliban so we could negotiate, to open an office for Hamas so we can negotiate, despite us being sort of this broker, we're not doing any of that bidding. It is pure pandemonium and crisis. And so what you see then is, and this is why I say this is really sad and convoluted, is you see what sort of pressure the Americans and the rest of the world can put on the Israelis to come to the table. Because now Netanyahu is summoned and you see Trump hand him a phone and he has to call the Qataris and apologize. And they tell them, the Americans, through Witkoff and now Jared Kushner, who has reemerged from the dead, is now involved in these negotiations. And essentially they're telling the Israelis, you have to accept this peace proposal. Well, let's dig a little deep into what the peace proposal is. At the end of the day, it was the release of all of the remaining Israeli prisoners in Gaza, all of the remaining abductees, people who had been kidnapped, as well as all the Palestinians who have been abducted, or at least 2,000 of the 6,000. And so you see that exchange of the people who had not been killed, the Israelis who had not been killed in Gaza, they're released. And then you see almost 2,000 Palestinians get released. And so that was a part of this phase of the first phase of the ceasefire. The other part was there are now 3 lines in Gaza, and the Israelis agreed as a part of phase 1, they will withdraw to the first line. And if we get to the next phase, they'll withdraw to the second line. And if we get to the third phase, they'll withdraw to the third line. If you look at these maps, James, the key point in all of this is not where these lines are drawn, but where the final line is drawn, because the Israelis have essentially created a buffer zone where they have taken parts of the Gaza Strip, where they have now, in this agreement, basically said, we're not going to give this back. We're going to be here forever. Like, this is now, we're changing the borders, essentially. And then they left all of the major issues. The last part of this is that Hamas has said that they will not participate in any Palestinian government, authority, or administration in the Gaza Strip. They are out of Palestinian politics. That was agreed. That's phase 1. The reason we got to phase 1 is because all of the other major issues have been pushed off to phase 2, and none of these have been reconciled yet. None of these have been addressed. These are things like what happens to the border between Gaza and Egypt? Will the Israelis maintain a checkpoint here? Will Palestinians be able to enter Israel or to go to Jerusalem to get medical treatment, or to the West Bank like they used to be able to before October 7th? Who will be allowed to bring aid in? Are the UN agencies there? What about these killing centers, the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, this American-Israeli initiative that had security contractors basically bid? Are they going to exist in this post, genocide Gaza. So none of these questions are answered. And there's an idea of we want an international stabilization force that can disarm Hamas, which I think Hamas has said they are willing to give up major weapons, but not small weapons. Well, who's going to do the disarming? Who is going to produce the troops for that? Where will they? How long will they be there for? And then finally, what is this transitional government going to look like? They want, of course, to have different people involved. Somehow, Tony Blair, talk about reemerging from the dead. He's involved in. Is he going to be the governor of this transitional moment? I don't know why he's in the mix at all. I have no idea. Nobody can explain to us what sort of role he'll play, and which is what Palestinians want. They want Palestinian technocrats, people who are apolitical, who are experts in health, in recovery, in finance. They want them to form a caretaker government that eventually leads to some sort of long-term government. None of these questions are answered. And the biggest issue that we've seen, and I will say this very bluntly and very clearly because this has been confirmed by all sources, is Netanyahu's government. There is a lot of deep unpopularity with the ceasefire proposal, with the agreement to this ceasefire. And 2 days after he agreed to the ceasefire, he had to show up in court for his corruption trial that he's undergoing. And you are seeing that this could potentially lead to elections in Israel. So you are talking about a government that has every excuse to make sure this ceasefire does not maintain any sort of sustainability. I will share 2 stories about this. The first is there were Israeli bulldozers in Rafah that were bulldozering buildings, and they are behind that first line that we talked about. They went over an unexploded ordnance, and 2 Israeli soldiers were killed. The Israelis immediately responded and said, "Oh, this was a Hamas attack," and they hit 11 or 14 different targets in Gaza, saying that. And in fact, Smotrich, who is the finance minister for the Israelis, tweeted or posted on X. He said literally just the word "war!" when this happened. Well, the Americans had been monitoring the situation. And so the Trump administration let the Israelis know. They said, "We know that this story is not true, so knock it off." So they stopped the bombing. And then they had also closed the border where aid would enter. And they said, reopen the border. And 3 hours later, Benjamin Netanyahu, with his tail between his legs, gets up and says, ceasefire's back on, border is open. There was some sort of issue that took place. So that was the first moment where we saw the ceasefire could fall apart. The second thing is there are these remains of hostages in Gaza, of Israeli hostages in Gaza, and there are 13 remaining remains. And so the Israelis are using this as an excuse to say that Hamas is violating the ceasefire and to bomb again. And the last 24 hours, there was apparently a skirmish between an undisclosed Palestinian armed group in Rafah, and then this delay in the handing over of remains, that the Israelis decided that we are going to punish Hamas for this. And the way that they punished Hamas is they killed 100 Palestinians, 36 of them were kids, in 24 hours. And so I was very disturbed by this, because when the Americans needed to show force on this, instead you had Rubio say, who again is a nobody in this administration, is not trusted, but you saw him jump in and say, we never said with this peace proposal that the Israelis couldn't defend themselves. They always will have the right to defend themselves. So again, lacking the leadership that's needed to say, this is Trump's peace proposal, and you're going to abide by the president's peace proposal. No, they didn't do that, like they did the first time around. And then you saw J.D. Vance say, no, there's still a ceasefire. There's still a ceasefire. And the Israelis killed 100 people. All of these different kids were killed. And they came out and they said, okay, ceasefire is back into effect. That's not how a ceasefire works. And if that is going to be the trajectory of the next few months, we are in for a total disaster. We're in for a total disaster, and we will see more bloodshed. We will see more people die unnecessarily. And that's really what bothers me. And I know I'm going on too long, but I'll say one last
No,
thing.
you're fine.
Witkoff and Kushner did a 60 Minutes interview that aired last Sunday. And they said it just shows you that both of these guys are not diplomats, which is a good and bad thing. They are not your, seasoned career politicians, right? So there's a couple of things that they said. The first is Kushner said he went to Gaza and it looked like an atomic bomb had gone off. Jared Kushner said this. And you can ask anybody. Jared Kushner is a fierce ally of Israel, of the state of Israel. He is self, proclaimed like he really wants that country to succeed. He really wants, it to be and he said it looked like an atomic bomb had went off. And then the other thing he said, I saw people going back to the north, and I asked the Israeli military, where are they going? Because it looked like an atomic bomb had went off. He said they're going to go and sit atop of where their homes once were, despite it being rubble. And he had said that was incredibly sad. Well, he's acknowledging something there, and I don't know if he realizes it, but he's acknowledging the indiscriminate bombing that the Israeli military had inflicted on the Gaza Strip. And he acknowledged that there's going to be a plight of displaced Palestinians who homes have been for no reason had gone off. And the final thing was what Witkoff was saying. Witkoff admitted, and this is something we knew, but this is important. He said this on 60 Minutes. The Americans had never directly, in all of our history and all of Hamas's history, we've never directly engaged in negotiations with them. We've just not done that. This was the first time where the president gave Witkoff and Kushner special permission to engage with them directly, because he felt that doing it through these intermediates and mediators wasn't getting the job done. And so they directly did it. That's something that the Israelis are strongly opposed. They strongly oppose that. They do not want the Americans communicating with any Palestinians without the Israelis babysitting it. And there's a reason for that. They want America and Israel want to be, from the Israeli perspective, they want to have the same message and they want to have the same line. And so this changed in these negotiations, and they were able to sort of get to, apply the pressure that was needed. So, this is where we're at right now. And if you could tell just by how long I was going on for, it is very concerning. Everybody's still very tense and anxious about what could happen.
What about the Israeli voice? Because I've said this the whole 2 years, that there's you saw this in Russia. There was a lot of opposition within Russia, and then all of a sudden there wasn't. And I'm assuming that means that the government made all those people go away, most likely. When I'm getting sound bites, but we all have a lean, so I don't know if the sound bites are just coming from an echo chamber, but I seem to see like there was a growing voice of this was never about the hostages from the Israelis themselves. I'm sure that the people in Tel Aviv would love to go along, get on with their life and not worry about being shelled or, IED or anything else going on. And so the average people from, everywhere on this damn planet just want to literally go to work, raise their kids, know that their kids are going to be safe in school. That's another entire American conversation in itself. So, what have you heard as far as the average Israeli voice and their perspective on this fragile ceasefire at the moment?
So I think, obviously, I'm not an expert on this, but what we're seeing really is a very similar sort of environment to American politics with how divisive and polarizing things are. I think you have people in Israel who are extremely, extremely upset and disappointed in the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu and cannot wait to see the day that he's out of power. And as you said, I think the hostage families have been this really well organized, powerful voice in Israeli internal politics and dynamics. They have really been one of the few. I think they've been able to break through in a way, whereas like if you're a part of the opposition, you're just sort of shut down, ignored. But they've been able to break through that to be able to really hold to account and continuously recenter the discussion towards, humans and not towards like, oh, we want to annihilate and decimate and all of these things. And I think one powerful message that arose was that the person who was the most the way that Netanyahu and the Israeli military were behaving in Gaza was clear that the priority was not the return of the hostages, and that became a salient message in Israel. Um, but again, you have I think, a society that is very polarized with respect to politics, and I think there's been. I'll tell you just from the perspective of what's happening in the West Bank with Israeli settlers who who have killed Americans. Actually, recently there was an American from Florida in the summer was visiting his family. He is a very young man, 19 or 20 years old, Saifullah, and he was beaten to death by Israeli settlers, and who were sort of raiding the village, the Palestinian village that he was in, and then they went ahead and blocked the ambulance from being able to get to him. So this guy died from a brain bleed. But that is happening. These sorts of that sort of violence is happening in the West Bank, and so you see it's a very this is a very polarizing thing, and so I think that's why the idea of an election for Netanyahu, he's very averse to that, like an early election where he has people sort of withdraw from his government, and then suddenly you're triggering elections in Israel. It's going to be, I think you're going to see all of these voices emerge in a very loud way. I think it's important for people to recognize that prior to what's happened in the last 2 years, Israeli society was at a standstill. Every single week, Israelis were in the streets protesting Benjamin Netanyahu, wanting him to resign, wanting the government to fall apart, and that they had had multiple elections in the previous 2 years and could never have a government that lasted until Netanyahu started joining forces with the extreme right and was able to kind of hold on to government. And then obviously when things break out, if you're pitching war to people, they don't want to change leadership in the middle of a war. So I think there's again, with how much discussion is taking place in inside, I think there's an aversion to politics if you're already in power, to elections, I should say.
So, sowing some seeds of hope to kind of leave as a final thought, what needs to happen so that we do see a conclusion to this horrendous chapter of modern society?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I think first and foremost, you have to understand that you cannot just assume that boots on the ground from an array of different countries are going to somehow create some degree of stability. Those people need to leave at some point. They'll never have a mandate forever, and eventually, that is an occupation. And so it's important, I think, for all parties to realize that safety and security is tied to the opportunities that are available for prosperity and for some future ahead. You need to provide for Palestinians need to have some degree of agency. They need to be able to have they have to have self-determination. They need to be involved in this recovery process. It cannot be Tony Blair, Indonesia, the UK, Egypt, kind of dictating what happens to Palestinians. No, you need to find the people that are embedded within the community, who are these leaders, who are people who people trust. You need to have them leading the effort. That needs to be a part of the equation. And right now, that's not what's happening. And I think that's why we're not seeing any sort of serious results as coming out of this. The other thing is the status quo is unsustainable. What do I mean by the status quo, which has been the policy of the United States for the last 6 decades? You've got this West Bank where there's a bunch of Palestinians, Gaza there's a bunch of Palestinians, East Jerusalem where there's a bunch of Palestinians, but you've got the Israeli military absolutely occupying and increasing their presence. It's not going to work. It's just not sustainable. It hasn't worked. It's been it's not provided any sort of safety or security for anybody. There needs to be, and I don't care if what people decide. I think at the end of the day, it is what it is: 1 state, 2 state, 3 state, 4 states. But there needs to be real stability here, and there needs to be real services. You cannot have corrupt despots showing up who are going to be like kind of dictating to people, and you're going to say, oh, that's your leader. And you cannot have a military that's going to monitor all movement, who's going to set up over 1,000 checkpoints, who's going to prevent people from ever leaving the Gaza Strip. It cannot happen. The way forward is not by repeating the mistakes of the past. The day after can't look like the day before. We can't go back to October 6th, 2023. If you do, we are going to fail miserably. It needs to be a dramatic change. And I know it's easier said than done, but I can tell you, if a Palestinian child can grow up and say, well, I want to travel the world, or I want to study engineering, or I want to visit Jerusalem, and you make that a reality for them, you will have safety, stability, security, and prosperity. There's no way around it. But if we were going to continue to prioritize land grabs, or natural gas off the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, or some sort of religious conviction that that you're entitled to everything, that you can grab onto, or all of these things, they will continue to bring about suffering, and it's not sustainable, and it's not in the long-term interests of any party, of anybody, on either. It doesn't matter how strong you are today or how weak you are today. It's not going to be sustainable by any means. There has to be a shift. There has to be a change. We have not done anything that's worked in 75 years of this conflict on the ground, and now we've had a genocide unfold in 2 years. And so that's what needs to happen. The only way that happens, and I know people are not going to want to hear it, but it starts with the United States. Nothing happens over the last 2 years without the United States either giving a green light or a red light. Nothing can change on the ground without the United States. We are still, for all intents and purposes, the most powerful country, the most influential country, and we are not just before USAID shut down, but not only were we sort of like providing military aid to the Israelis, but we were also funding all of these different humanitarian projects that in Palestine. And so it starts with us, and it starts with real leadership, and it's not going to be with neoconservatives or neoliberals or warmongers. It's going to be none of that. It's not going to be Ted Cruz or Lindsey Graham or Charles Schumer or Gavin Newsom. It will not be from those people. I promise you. They don't know what they want to keep things the way that they are, and the way that things are people are suffering unnecessarily. And yeah, it feels like it's 1,000 miles away, but it will be coming to it'll be coming to a place near you, or a place that you care about, or that's near and dear to your heart, and it will continue to grow. And this cycle of violence only grows and gets bigger and extends. And so I would say that's the immediate next step: is how can the United States change how it's mediating some of these things and influencing some of these things in a way that brings peace and prosperity. And I don't know. I think it needs more. I think we need better leaders.
I want to finish with the story that you literally told me in our very first conversation, which was on the way to Gaza. You were in Jerusalem, if I remember rightly, and you were seeing Christians and Muslims and Jews all worshiping side by side, praying side by side. So let's kind of leave with that image of what can be. I mean, the people just seeing the shared humanity rather than the divisive religious labels that we're putting on them.
Well, I just experienced that in the first week of October. I was in Jerusalem, and same thing. I mean, people buying falafel sandwiches from each other. Where you see Orthodox Jews walking through. They've got their entire like religious attire on. You saw Christians from all over the world, at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or at the Greek Orthodox Church, or visiting all of the other churches that were there. And you saw Muslims that were entering. And the only issue that was there, James, the only sort of, the only conflict was the presence of the Israeli military that were there in the old city that were harassing people. Everyday human beings, Muslims, Jews, Christians, families, were just walking around, living life normally. I mean, buying sandwiches from each other, literally. And it was only when you had that the institution that was sort of harassing people, that was the only sort of like negative vibe in that atmosphere, in that environment. And I tell you, it's there. I mean, I think the ability for people to coexist and to live and to move forward, it's there. And I just think that the current institutions that are in place, they're what are tearing people apart. And I think, I just I'm hopeful that the next generation is smarter than we are, wiser than we are, and more moral than we are. And I think it's possible. I think it's very, very possible.
Well, there, I want to thank you again. Another 2-hour conversation. I was thinking every time we sit down, I'm like, oh, this will be shorter because we talked already for, in prior episodes.
Right.
But here we are again. But this is what's so important, is to hear, of such a full conversation, and obviously start, at home and then go over to Gaza. But this is what educates us, and this is what I think brings us into the middle. Is who would want someone to suffer of whatever color, creed, gender orientation, whatever it is, unless they were literally a human being that is beyond help. Everyone else, it's about healing. And then I've always said this. I mean, I'm not an expert in every single religion and their holy book, but it seems like the wisdom that lasts the ages is, hey, war is really bad. Color, community, kindness, compassion, empathy, love, service. Those are the things that will actually make you happy. Next generation, next generation, next generation. So, it's so important, I think, to hear, keep hearing these conversations as we're going along, and just being dogmatic as far as standing, with that moral courage, that having that moral compass, not about, left, right, this religion, that religion, but just getting back to the middle of what is right. And I think most of us know exactly what is right and what is wrong. And what's happened recently is absolutely wrong. And the nuances and the backstories, of course, they come into how did we get here? But the point is now, where do we go from here? So I want to thank you so much again for being so generous with your time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast.
Always a pleasure, and always learn something when I come on too, so I appreciate that.